All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Our topic today is on forgiveness, healing, brokenness, and relationships. And so when we talk about forgiveness, we would not need forgiveness if there was never a problem. When the world was created, it was perfect and everything was fine. And so there's no need for forgiveness. It's only because sin entered that we need forgiveness in the first place. And so when the subject of forgiveness comes up, I think about all the variety of issues that hurt relationships, that hurt people, and break the bonds that our families have, whether it's between mother and son, daughter and father, etc. And so we're getting into the most difficult parts. And so one common response to negative emotions or negative things is just to shut down and keep it moving, to not acknowledge what's going on, but just to move past it and think, I'll do better tomorrow, or things will work out okay. We don't need to talk about that right now, and just try to mask away our difficulties. And sometimes we do this because we don't really know how to address them. So in her book, The Scars That Have Shaped Me, Vanitha Risner talks about, when I don't acknowledge my pain, my lips may say one thing, but my heart says another. I start to wall off my heart so I can conjure up joy. And I see this all the time with my middle school kids, particularly the boys and sometimes the girls, where they will have what they call in social work flat affect, where you don't, it's like a poker face in a way, where they'll be telling you about bullying or something intense that's going on in their life, but if you look at their face, it just doesn't match. You wonder, is something actually wrong? Or it gets very confusing, and that's one way kids learn how to deal with it, and it's not very healthy. And sometimes they learn this from their family. And so she continues, but these walls make me numb to real emotion, unable to experience either pleasure or pain. My life flatlines as I start to exist without really living. So you see this a lot with kids who are focused on what the next step is. Okay, I just get into this center and then I'll be happy. I just do really well in this program and it'll all work out. Or maybe tomorrow it will be okay. But when we start to get like that, we start to lose the preciousness of what life means. Life goes from colorful in its good and bad ways to just gray and numb. And so our main point from this seminar when we're talking about forgiveness is that true healing requires transparency. So when you go to a doctor, the doctor asks what's going on. And if you don't tell them all of your symptoms, then you're not going to get the right medicine and you're not going to get the right treatment. But to be fully transparent, you have to trust the doctor, because if you don't trust the doctor or the medical professional, then you may feel more subconscious, not wanting to say things or saying why you got hurt, things like that. And the doctor won't get the full story because the trust isn't there. And trust is developed over time, requiring vulnerability. And so that means being able to talk about and experience the highs and lows of life rather than just giving the highlight reel. And so when we're talking about healing, we're talking about vulnerability. And Paul Tripp, in his book about parenting, talks about what it means to actually plunge into the negative aspects of our relationships, particularly with our children. And that it's not a simple process. Forgiveness isn't a one-time deal. So he explains his main point. Parenting is not a series of dramatic confrontation confession events, but rather a lifelong process of incremental awareness and progressive change. The 4-year-old will not say after you confront him, I am a self-centered, self-ruling idolater in need of redemption. The middle schooler will not become a fully transformed human being, and the teenager will still need your parenting wisdom. I think the desire for overnight change gets us in trouble. So a lot of the times when we're talking about forgiveness or how to restore relationships, some people go to a counselor or a pastor, or I go to my friends and I'm looking for things to get better. I'm usually looking for a one-time fix. That's usually the process of how things go. But let's see, but change doesn't always happen that way. And we will start off in prayer as the new people arrive. Dear God, thank you so much for being with us and being patient with us and forgiving us. Even though we do not deserve forgiveness on our own, it's by your grace that we receive that. And please help us to learn how to extend that grace to children, particularly our own at our church. Even in difficult moments when we're frustrated and feeling like things aren't working and wondering why they are the way that they are. And please give us patience as they continue to develop physically, mentally, and spiritually. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. And Paul expands on this point. Sin blinds, and guess who it blinds first? I have no problem seeing the sin of my family members, neighbors, and friends, but I can be quite surprised when somehow my sin is exposed. It's Jeremiah who talks about the heart being deceptively wicked and no one being able to fully understand it. It often takes someone calling me out or calling someone else out for that person to understand what's going on. So when we talk about our own children, especially me growing up in elementary school and middle school, I would know exactly what's right and what's wrong. And I would call out my younger sister on things. I would call my dad and my mom out on things. I would call people out at school who were doing things that are wrong. But when it came to myself, I was blind to my own faults. And that is something that's really difficult when it comes to kids and the subject of forgiveness. When things are so plain as day, how do they not see that what they're doing is wrong? Well, they're stuck in their own viewpoint. Your children are not just selfish and rebellious, they are blind. What by God's grace is clear to you is not clear to them. What seems obvious to you is not obvious to them. And so especially with families that have multiple siblings and multiple kids, they may be very quick to point out their siblings' flaws. My brother did this, my sister's being annoying, while not understanding what's going on. One funny joke about this is in the most recent days, the show Caillou's been coming up. And it's about I think it's a toddler boy who doesn't have much hair that has a younger sister. And when I looked on Reddit and other things about it, it was just really funny. It's all these parents complaining, Caillou made my kid a brat. And I'm like, okay, why is it making your kid a brat? And then I looked at YouTube and had a few clips on where Caillou's just acting very bratty and very obnoxious, annoying, and self-centered. And one is he's trying to build a train set on the floor and his little sister comes crawling in and messes with it. And on her vantage point, she's just trying to play with the same things and have a good time with him. From his perspective, it is, she's messing with my train track. It's not right. I don't get it. And so he ends up complaining and just wrecking everything. And so parents are saying, Caillou is just making my kid obnoxious because he's showing how self-centered children are. But in reality, this is how kids are. They see things their way. They are right until proven wrong, until proven very wrong. And he expands. And because they don't see what you see, they think you are wrong and needlessly judgmental. You're just not going to get one conversation turnarounds, and going into these times of correction with these expectations will cause a lot of irritation, impatience, and discouragement inside you. And I almost wish my parents could be a part of this seminar and were, because they would tell me on paper that I grew up knowing a ton about the Bible, a ton about all the different accounts from Genesis to Revelation. I could recite trivia and things like that, and I would know what's right on paper. But when it came to actually living out, particularly with my family, it was rough. It was a lot of blaming my sister for things, saying my parents are getting on to me too much and things like that without acknowledging my own errors. And it took a long, long time for that to happen. And some days I would ask for forgiveness or accept that I was wrong. And another day I would just shut down and just deny everything. And so Tripp explains that when it comes to forgiveness, it a journey. It's not a one time, your kid will see the light and then no more issues will happen. It's going to be a constant grind, and expecting for a hallelujah mountaintop moment where you say, I'm sorry, or they say, I'm sorry, and then everything gets better and then it stays better for a long time is a complete lie. And you see that in relationships too, with dating and then into marriage, that you can have a great breaking through time where the relationship is very calm and work things out, but then 2 weeks later something new comes up. And then you just have to get back to forgiving, understanding the person's perspective, hearing them out, and go through the whole process again. It's the same exact thing with kids. All right. And then going back to what I was saying earlier about healing, transparency, trust, and vulnerability. So it's one thing with us, it's another with our kids. And for a lot of people, me included with kids, it's hard to be vulnerable when you inherently think you know more and are better than kids in some way or another. Well, I see the perspective fully. Well, they're clearly in the wrong here and things like that. And that type of thinking drives a wedge into relationships and prevents vulnerability that can lead to healing. So when it talks about healing requires transparency, meaning get everything out in the open. Transparency requires trust. That means your kids have to trust you just as much as you trust them. And trust is developed over time, requiring vulnerability. And so when we're talking about this, we have to understand sometimes that we're in the wrong and we may have to be vulnerable. It may be hard for kids to be vulnerable with us, and it's equally just as hard sometimes for us to be vulnerable with them. And so Vanitha Rendell Risner talks about, in the same book I alluded to earlier, about the scars that have shaped me. She talks about how dangerous the one-time healing, the one-time rescue, the one conversation forgiveness talk, these breakthrough moments aren't always what God gives us. And for context on what she's talking about, she's been through a lot of suffering. She grew up with polio, or a similar disease that crippled her legs to where she could not walk, and kids frequently bullied her when she grew up in her home nation of India. And there were times where she was walking home and kids would push her to the ground and she'd have to keep moving. And I'm sure many times she prayed that God would heal her legs. And she talked about once going to a faith healer, hoping he would heal her. And then the faith healer came up to her and said, sorry, you don't have enough faith because it's just not working. And then she, going further into her life, lost one of her kids at the age of 2 months, where he wasn't expected to live, and suddenly everything was great. And then the cardiologist, a sub-cardiologist, came in and said, we don't need to give him more medication because clearly he's healed. And within a week, the child just passed away. And then with her marriage, she had a husband leave her without explaining why, just out of nowhere. So when she talks about deliverance, there's been many things in her life which she sought deliverance from. And here's what she reflects on. You'll never hear anyone in the Bible complaining about the parting of the Red Sea. Everyone loves the grace that delivers us. But the Israelites, like us, were dissatisfied with the daily manna. We all complain about grace that merely sustains us. So when we're talking about conflict resolution and forgiveness in our families, we love to picture, oh, I said I'm sorry, or they said I'm sorry, and everything is better. Or when we wake up, everything will be fine. And we hope that our kids learn lessons quickly, rather than understanding or sometimes accepting that sometimes takes a long time. And it can be really difficult to wait. But here's what she says about waiting. But the answers of wait or no have done a far deeper work in my soul. They have kept me connected to the giver and not his gifts. They have forced me to seek him being God. And in seeking him, I found a supernatural joy beyond all comparison, simply based on his tender presence. So when we talk about forgiveness, we're going to get into the end about application. But when it comes down to it, I can understand you can receive so much information about methods on how to make it work. but strategies don't always work. You try them, you try them, you try them, but no matter what, it's going to take a long time, and results don't always come quickly. And the struggle of it is what connects us more to God and what brings us more closer to Him. And I'm reminded of this passage in Habakkuk where God is talking about how the Babylonians are going to come wipe out the Israelites and send them into captivity because they are unfaithful. And this is the last two verses, or the last three verses at the two of the last three verses in the chapter. And if you read Habakkuk, it's just so depressing. The prophet's asking God, well, what can be done? What can be done? What's going to happen? And just begging, hoping there's going to be a different answer. And God just keeps saying, it's going to be judgment. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's just going to be judgment. And the prophet reflects on this and knowing what's going to come. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop ails and the field produce no food, then though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God, my Savior. So when we're talking about conflict and things like that, sometimes what we want more than anything is deliverance from it, for our families to be healed immediately. What's going on, God? I don't get it. And sometimes the struggle can bring us closer to God. So sometimes it's the quick fix, which we pray for and we really want. And I would encourage us to pray for that because it shows us and reminds us that God is the true source of healing, but sometimes healing happens on a different schedule. And sometimes in the waiting can be our most great time to draw closer to God when we don't understand what exactly He's doing. And so Vinitha expands, part of really living is being willing to face sadness, not wallowing in my pain and refusing to be comforted, but honestly and openly telling God where I am and asking Him to show me truth. Letting Him, the God of all comfort, comfort me. Letting Him, the God of all hope, fill me with hope. And letting Him, the man of sorrows, familiar with grief, bear my sorrows with me. So she talks about how in her struggles, what healed her the most was God comforting her, God giving her hope, God bearing her sorrows. She even talked about when her husband left her that her teenage daughters all of a sudden didn't want to go to church anymore. They didn't care about God. They would yell at her saying, this is how your God treated you. You're so faithful and you talk about how good God is, and look, our dad left. And so what she does not say is that, oh, well, I worked it over my daughters and everything worked out. That's not where she found her true source of healing in the midst of all the stress that she found. It was straight from God. And this is the model I'd like us to consider when it comes to forgiveness. And when I talked earlier about vulnerability and trust, these are the themes that we see in our relationship with God, that we need to fully talk about what's going on with Him and let Him carry our burdens rather than us feeling like we just need to soldier on and just focus on results. And that true healing comes from relationship rather than specific outcomes. And this is what our kids need when we actually act out what forgiveness looks like. And so the first is emotion identification. So one could be, well, I'm frustrated. I wish I had a better job, or I wish I got a job in Richmond. That's my current scenario, where I left a job that was very stressful and unethical. And there's been times I've been frustrated with God, wondering, why didn't that work out? I need a new job. And sometimes when we just focus on what we want, we don't really get deeper into it. So if I'm looking at this chart here, which is one of many examples, I could say sometimes I'm depressed, wondering if God is really there for me. Or sometimes I'm lonely without things to occupy my time. Or I'm surprised that God let that happen. And when we get to the more emotion side of it, that's where God can bring more healing into the situation. And you see the full complexity of a situation. And particularly when it comes to anger, this is a big key point. And if anyone is curious about resources and things like that, please let me know. When I'm working with kids and counseling, when it comes to anger, when we talk about forgiveness, sometimes there's a lot of anger involved. People have hurt people, people have done wrongdoings and things like that, and there can be a lot of anger and resentment. But there's always something behind the anger. So if a kid's yelling and things like that, sometimes I will say, can you point to me which of these faces you feel? Because a lot of the kids lack the vocabulary to fully understand what's going on. So there can be shame and sadness and embarrassment or jealousy going on. And if they can pinpoint what's going on, that can be much more easy to deal with than just straight anger. And then I will close with this, with this verse, a story, and then some application for us to close. So forgiveness restores and bitterness separates. I like to say, if a lot of the times, if things are sometimes feel too difficult, it's because we're perceiving in the wrong way. So if a child is angry or we're angry at them, there's something that we must work through. And Ephesians talks about get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. And sometimes that involves getting rid of a lot of resentment that we feel. Sometimes resentment can make us feel powerful or actually validated. And so that's something we have to work through and find that validation somewhere else, particularly from God. But rather, be kind and compassionate towards one another, forgiving each other just as Christ forgave you. So one story we have when we talk about, and I'll go back to that slide really quick, when the first part of his sentence, and because they don't see what you see, they think you're wrong and is needlessly judgmental. And I was working in elementary school. I was working with one kid who had been bounced from house to house to house. I think at least 5 different houses before the age of 5, where family members would reject her and say, no, you're too wild and hyper and aggressive for you to live with us. We just can't stand it anymore. And I guess my metaphor from that would be, if Zoe had lived with Pastor Rowe and Natalie and something happened where she couldn't live with them anymore, and she went to 4 different church families, and within 2 months, all of them said, nope, we can't handle it. Sorry, it's not going to work out. And so one time, I don't remember the exact circumstances, but this one child was aggressive in the classroom because some kids with trauma will initiate that aggression or initiate that anger because it's easier, and this is really sad if you really think about it, it's easier to be rejected on your own terms than have someone reject you out of nowhere. Where she thought, if I'm angry or if I'm yelling and screaming and throwing objects, and I can test out that caregiver and see if they're going to leave me at the drop of a hat, rather than me living my life and suddenly they leave. So anyway, the assistant principal pulled her out of the class because she was being too aggressive and had to be in a separate room. And then she's in there yelling, screaming, punching the walls, etc. This poor 5-year-old who can't conceptualize, who probably in the moment just saw that she got separated from the teacher that she really has an attachment to. And so I was tasked to go in the room and try to help her out. And we're talking about forgiveness here. And this is an example of there being a conflict, there being a strained relationship that has to be worked out in some way, somehow. So anyway, I go in there and I was immediately thought, there's no words I can give this child that will make her fully understand why she got taken out. Because sometimes when she's angry and kids get angry, they're so enwrapped in the anger and the hurt that they, number one, can't understand what's going on because their amygdala, their fight or flight response is triggered. And number two, she's only 5. There's only so much vocabulary and explanation that she can actually understand at that age. So anyway, I ended up just sitting by her while she's yelling and screaming in my face, balling her fist, threatening to hit me, etc. I was praying through, what can I say to this child? She can't understand. She doesn't see what I see. She doesn't understand the full picture. So I ended up telling her though you may not understand it, we just want to help you. And every day we're doing our best to help you. And sometimes, though we are helping you, it actually feels that we're hurting you. But at the end of the day, I need you to know that no matter what you do, I am here for you and we're here from you and we're not going to give up on you. And somehow from bawling her fists up, yelling, screaming, wanting to attack me, angry at the world for always taking away those she loves, she dropped all of her anger just dropped at the moment, and then she came up and gave me a hug. And I was just so shocked. And she was completely fine after that. And so when we're talking about forgiveness and things like that, sometimes it, number one, takes the parent to initiate forgiveness, to acknowledge when things are wrong or acknowledge their own brokenness. There's been so many kids I've counseled throughout the years that our most deep moments are when I promised, hey, I'm going to see you in 5 minutes, and something comes out and I'm gone for 15 and I don't see them for a while, and they say, where were you? You said you'd be there in 5 minutes. And me saying, oh, I'm sorry, I really wanted to make it in 5, but I couldn't. I shouldn't have made a promise if I wasn't able to keep it. Things like that. And there's been, with the kids I've worked with, so many of them are used to adults being like invincible in a way, that they're never wrong, that whatever they say is law, and that they never mess up or anything like that. And when they do mess up, you're just supposed to look past it. Now, I'm not advocating for kids to call out their parents on things, but sometimes parents, it's good for us and good for parents to have some vulnerability to say when things are wrong, or acknowledge when there's misunderstanding. And that way it's not the child only perceiving it and not actually being able to work through it. And then there's also been times in my own life where I don't understand what God is doing, and it's so hard for me to know and understand. But knowing that God doesn't give up on me, but God forgives me and has patience with me. There's been so many times in my life where I prayed for hours and hours about something and the result just doesn't happen. And there's been times where I go back to spots I prayed at, or I think about it and I remembered it was God's grace actually sustaining me rather than rescuing me. And often what kids need more than anything is that sustaining grace, to know that you're going to be there for them even when the forgiveness doesn't work out as much as you hoped, and when their actions don't deserve the grace, that you're still there with them in the moment. And so when it comes to application, I don't really have any specific recommendations on how forgiveness looks like. There's a lot of different ideas, and how it works is often specific to your own family. But in general, I'll go back to the healing part. One is transparency, fully talking about what happened, and it's allowing the parent to talk about and then the child to share their perspective. And then trust, meaning that assurance of no matter what happens, I will hear you out and I will love and care for you no matter what, that unconditional love. And then the vulnerability goes along with the transparency, where it made me really upset that blank happened, or I was really frustrated when you yelled at me, and I felt very angry that you were disrespectful, things like that. And that's where a lot of the emotional vocabulary can come in. But overall, forgiveness is a conversation, whether it happens over getting ice cream, whether it's talking in the car where neither person has to look at the other person. However it looks like for you may depend. But overall, it's a process and something that first comes from God. And when we feel that forgiveness and peace from God, it makes it so much easier for us to extend that to our children. With that, that is everything we have. Does anyone have any questions?
I have a question. So I don't fully understand why trust is developed over time, requiring vulnerability? I mean, what's the relationship between trust and vulnerability?
Okay, between trust and vulnerability.
Yeah.
Okay, my metaphor from that is that, for example, trust falls. For example, trust falls require falling back. You can trust that someone will catch you, but you won't know until you fall back. And what I mean with trust and vulnerability is, especially particularly with my own parents, and you all may have experienced this growing up. If your mom catches you catches half of the wrong that you've done and not all of it, for example, and sometimes a child doesn't want to share the full story. But in order to build, where was I going with that? I apologize. And vulnerability.
Like, what would that look like between you and your parents?
Okay, thank you, Joe. Yes. Okay, so one would be, actually, and the more I look at it, maybe vulnerability requires trust. I think that would be the better way to put it. Where they go hand in hand. Where it requires some moments where you don't know if the relationship will break, or things like that. But what are you saying, Zifan?
Yeah, that's my guess. It's like I do not need to pretend to be perfect in order to correct my children. Is that its meaning? I'm not sure. Yeah.
Can you say that one more time about the perfect part? I didn't quite.
That means I do not need it. It's like I need to somehow expose my own weakness to my children in order to develop trust.
My point with that is, which I can see that perspective, where it's focusing on what they did. A lot of the kids, particularly at our church, are used to where they need to apologize and things like that, but they don't really have a good model of what that looks like. And where the vulnerability and things like that is important, where they don't, and if they don't see their parents ever being vulnerable, it's them who's always in the wrong. It's always that. And then there's been times where my mom's been late picking me up from soccer practice or things like that. And it doesn't have to be anything deep. It doesn't have to be the full story. Hey, sorry, Jordan, I'm late. I'm sure you had to wait a while. Something like that. It doesn't have to be, well, I got caught up in doing this and cleaning up that. And it doesn't have to be the full story, but just little bits can help. Or else a child can feel either victimized or that they are always at fault rather than the parent, when sometimes it's a mix. What were you going to say, Ro?
Yeah, as a parent myself, and also, just being a teacher, I can see why it's so important for vulnerability, because like my parents were not vulnerable. And so growing up, all I learned is be quiet, let them talk. And because of that, I wasn't really good at opening up to other people. And you can see that in our youth group. Like when you put them in small groups, they don't tend to open up. Could be because they don't open up at home. That could be one reason. I've noticed with Zoe, first of all, we would never let Zoe we would keep Zoe, even if she is a problem. But anyway, I've noticed that if we're angry at her for doing something wrong, she will listen because she doesn't want to get in trouble. But we've also noticed that when we let her know that we're upset, but be vulnerable, then all of a sudden she tells us, just like your picture of that angry, there's so many things that are going on in a 5-year-old's head that you don't really know. She then tells us the reasons why she was going through things. And without that knowledge from what's in her mind, we got her wrong. Even though that outside, this is our perception, inside, just like Kailu, she has a different way of seeing things, and being vulnerable allows her that ability to help us to see what's really going on in her mind. Does that make sense? Why we need to be vulnerable?
And also with the anger, it can unpack why the parent is angry. And it gives you a glimpse into the parent's heart. There'd be times growing up where my parents were upset with me and I would shut down and walk away because I felt like all I saw was anger. And that was it. And it's like, for example, what if people only read the Old Testament and saw God as just angry? They wouldn't understand the heart behind it. And you'd have to explain why sin hurts God and things like that. Likewise, with parents, sometimes kids see their parents as just angry or upset with them without knowing what's behind it. And when they get angry, they don't really know how. That's such an overwhelming thing that they don't know how to cope with. And in some little things, and they call this the language of attachment. It made me sad when this. It made me worried when this. It disappointed me when this happened. And what this means for a child is that what I do affects you positively and negatively, and that's a relationship more than you just telling me what to do or me just correcting my actions.
Yeah. And the reason why we're having this seminar is because in our youth group studies, we asked the kids about how they deal with forgiveness. And they said the way we do it at home is we don't talk about it and we just move on. Mm-hmm. And most of them just nodded. And so they don't know how to talk about their feelings. They don't even know if it's appropriate to. So that's another real reason why we need to be vulnerable.
Ange and I watched a movie last week. It's called, what?
The Farewell.
The Farewell.
It's Otaku.
Yeah. They keep trying. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just an interesting picture of what the Chinese culture, how they deal with some of this. And I think you just have a huge cultural difference in that movie. The daughter, who is a Chinese American and more American, really wants to share these emotions and share these frustrations with her parents. But the parents who are more culturally Chinese, that is never done. You don't talk about those very deep feelings. And so they get upset at the daughter for insisting that they basically, the daughter sort of wants them to be American in that way. She wants to have these emotional conversations. And then the parents are very upset at her because they want her to be more Chinese, that you shouldn't talk about these things. And it was just a really interesting story to look through. You don't know, I don't want to say that one person is right or one culture is right or wrong. They're just really different. So what I'm fascinated by is, what does the Bible say? Like, what is the correct thing to do in these situations?
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing I noticed in my middle school boys is they've completely lacked the emotional vocabulary. You ask them how they're doing, they'll give one-word answers, and sometimes the girls too.
Yes.
And since we've been like diving deeper through studies on what anxious and anxiety and depression and other things look like in the Bible and what it means to have a fuller relationship with God, some of them have opened up with that vocabulary. One told me, well, I'm anxious about what it means to go into 9th grade. And that's a different conversation versus, I don't think 9th grade is going to go well. Anxiety can be healed. Just straight pessimism and shutting down is much harder to heal. But that's where, and I wouldn't want to go full-blown American and say the parent has to say like the complete story every time about where they may have messed up. And it's not like you're their best friend. And that's where I could see it frustrated me when you did this. I was really sad that you did this because I care about you. That's a different conversation versus describing all the backstory like you would going to God in prayer.